Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. And today we have a really excellent group to talk to you about human rights defenders. I'd like to turn it over to Allison Finley, who with the U.S. government. We're delighted that you were able to moderate the session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Maura. So as Maura said, I'm Allison Finley. I work for the U.S. Department of State and am a representative for the United States as current chair of the Voluntary Principles Initiative on Security and Human Rights, or VPI. And I'm delighted to be joined today for this very important discussion and launch by authors of the two important guidances and reports that we are launching today. So first, we'll be joined by Joelle Bassina from LITE-Africa, who authored the report on the situation of human rights defenders in Africa. And also Bennett Freeman, who authored the guidance on respecting human rights defenders, which is a first of its kind guidance for the Voluntary Principles Initiative and MSIs of its kind. We'll also be joined by two additional panelists, Carmen Rosa de Leon from IEPADES, sorry, Carmen, in Guatemala. She is the European representative for IEPADES, and Hannah Blythe, who is a conflict and fragility specialist for the International Finance Corporation. So the format of our discussion today will feature remarks from both Joelle and Bennett on their respective guidance and report, and then followed by reactions and insights from our panelists from IEPADES and the IFC. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, and we really hope that this will be a very open, free-flowing discussion. We want you to ask all the hard questions and really challenge our panelists and each other to think through how we're going to address protection of human rights defenders through this initiative. So I'll just start by saying that on behalf of the United States, as the current chair of the Voluntary Principles Initiative on Security and Human Rights, I'm really honored to be with you all today. Elevating the critically important role of human rights defenders and supporting them in doing their work safely is not only a U.S. foreign policy priority, but it's also an imperative for advancing human rights for all. The United States remains resolute in its commitment to supporting human rights defenders, who play an integral role in protecting civic space, mobilizing citizens to exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and advocating for transparency and accountability from their governments. In 2021, the United States released guidelines for our diplomatic missions with strategies and tools that our missions could employ to support and protect civil society and human rights defenders. We also support civil society and HRDs through programs like the Lifeline Embattled CSOs Assistance Fund, our award honoring HRDs from around the world, an informal interagency working group that monitors violence against environmental defenders, and through various multilateral and multi-stakeholder initiatives such as the VPI. We hope that this first of its kind guidance and the information we discuss today will help VPI participants to identify actionable solutions to improve human rights defender protection and to take practical steps to implement more robust support mechanisms for defenders under threat. The United States is also working with the European Union through the US-EU Trade and Technology Council to release joint public guidance, which will focus on how online platforms can more effectively mitigate, prevent, and enable access to remedy for digital attacks targeting HRDs, including gender-based online harassment and abuse targeting women and LGBTQI+ HRDs. In developing our own guidance for technology companies, we drew upon the recommendations shared in the guidance we will discuss today. We see the two documents as complementary and mutually reinforcing. In conjunction with the TTC, the US and EU are also developing resilient supply chains and discussing how trade can promote labor rights. Workers and labor leaders are on the front lines to spot labor violations, and they too have also been targeted with harassment. In closing, this is an exciting moment and milestone for the VPI. As VPI members who share a commitment to protecting HRDs and supporting their work, we must do more to address the risks they face and threats to civic space around the world. We know that multi-stakeholder cooperation is crucial to this, as no government, mechanism, company, or organization can do this alone. Let's use this time together today to have an open dialogue about how we can all commit to doing better together. We are honored to work with you all in this effort, And with that, I'll turn it over to Joelle to provide an overview of the new report on the situation of human rights defenders in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Alison Finley. Thank you for that background to this presentation. First, I must really appreciate the Secretariat for providing the support that had enabled us to try to understand the unique situation of human rights defenders in Africa. But we all know that debate and discussions on human rights issues are made possible because there are people on the ground who are chesting out and sticking out their neck for the common good of all. It is on this premise that LITE-Africa took a look at the unique situation in which human rights defenders are carrying out their work in Africa, with a focus on South Sudan, DRC, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana. What I'm going to do today is just to give us a little bit about the methodology that was adopted in the study, key findings, the challenges in carrying out this, and a few recommendations. I know that the details are contained in the comprehensive report, which is also available to as many that want to take a look at it. Next slide. Now, in conducting this survey and study, we use a mixed methods of strategies to develop content and generate content for this. In doing that, we carried out surveys and interview, and we also did the desk review of existing materials to fill in gaps on human rights defenders with respect to VP risk assessment framework. In carrying out this, we also collaborated with the Secretariat, like I said, who provided the support, both financial and otherwise, in enabling us to carry out this. We also work closely with the Nigerian Working Group to generate content and crowdsource materials. We set up consultative meetings, including meetings with the Gender Vulnerable Groups Consultative Meeting, interview with members. The study was conducted using purposive interviews, which were conducted from a sample drawn from among human rights defenders working in resource-endowed countries in Africa, which I've just mentioned. We also interviewed some VPI members and observers. All the data gathered from reviews and interviews were triangulated, analyzed. Next slide. At the end of the day, these were some of the key findings that we were able to generate. Our review of the VP policy, there is no specific recognition of human rights defenders or mention of it. Terms like opposition, NGOs are commonly used, even though it doesn't seem to reflect what current situations are. Defenders hardly enjoy the right to peaceful assembly in most of the countries, as they increasingly suffer arrest, detention, extrajudicial killing, and administrative harassment. There is excessive use of force by security providers against defenders, and this is commonplace across the region, especially in those countries that the study was conducted. We also found out that defenders' freedom of association is under threat due to administrative and judicial harassment that offers grounds for dissolution of human rights defenders' organization. You know, in some countries, it is even difficult to even get organizations registered, and where they even allow registrations to happen, it takes forever for CSOs to go through the hurdle of registration. There is also issue of strategic litigation against public participation slabs, suit and criminal investigation by extractives, and agribusiness against defenders in Nigeria, Ghana, and Southern Africa. This was also noticed in other countries, but it was more rampant in the countries mentioned. We also discovered that NGOs and defenders are not aware of formal processes for HRD to assess company grievance mechanism, except in the extent of external pressures or company mostly from INGOs. What we found out is that most of the companies, some of them do have grievance mechanisms that are in place, but they seem to reside more in papers than putting them to practice. And human rights defenders have very little knowledge about the existence of such mechanisms, and so they could not really use them to hold corporations accountable. Then the issue of training of military personnel. Military personnel are poorly trained and ill-equipped. Security personnel, because of their use of excessive force, they compromise the rights of defendants. There is also lack of consultation with critical stakeholders, including communities and defenders, women, youth, and journalists, including indigenous people and other vulnerable groups, on natural resource extraction. There is the absence of social inclusion policies and programs were identified as factors in heightening the risks faced by human rights defenders. Some of the corporations may have some of these policies. Like I said earlier on, the knowledge of their existence is quite limited, so they are not, they do not serve the necessary enabler for human rights defenders to use them as either for advocacy or holding companies accountable. Next slide. Some of the challenges in doing this is the unwillingness on the part of human rights defenders to respond to survey instruments. Because of the way in some of the countries, the way the work of human rights defenders are monitored, they are more like censored. When you may put a call across to organizations and you say you want to talk about human rights issues, they get excited. But when you get drilled down to say, oh, okay, we want to get some facts about what is on the ground, country, we're going to be sending you a survey instrument and we would like to set up a date for interview. Once they go through the survey instrument, you put calls across again, nobody picks on the other end, it will ring and that will just be. So this explains the low number of persons that were interviewed because of fear. I mean, shrinking civic space in African continent, especially most of the countries also explain the unwillingness of human rights defenders who work in very critical situations to respond and participate in the process. Inability of LITE-Africa personnel that travels to various countries of studies also was a major challenge. Because we felt if maybe we are on the ground, even though there are risks associated with such travels, but we are taught that human rights defenders will feel more comfortable, having face-to-face discussion as against sending in those survey instruments and trying to set up phone calls. So that's one area that we also identified. Next slide, as a challenge. So from all the challenges and the findings, we make the following recommendations for consideration: that the VPI should explicitly acknowledge the vital role of human rights defenders in promoting human rights and sustainable development in accordance with the UN guiding principles. Because, like I said earlier on, it is the work of human rights defenders that accentuate the discussions and the debate on human rights issues. And if their work is not acknowledged, policy documents and in a strategic documents, then the ability to do more will be limited. The VPI pillar members should also demonstrate commitment to protection of human rights defenders, through specific policies or statements on human rights defenders to operationalize their human rights commitment. Most of the members of the VPI, especially the corporate, they seem to have human rights policies, but only few of them do have a commitment, a statement either in their human rights policy or. Hello, can you hear me?
Okay, yes, now I can
Hello.
hear you. Okay. Yes. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, so companies should also have established formal process for HDR to assess company grievance mechanism and create awareness around it to potentially address grievances that often result in most defendants' issues. And then funding of capacity building programs for human rights defenders around is also critical in this direction. Then we also need to talk about the issue of shrinking civic space. The funding should specifically address frameworks relating to business and human rights issues and also issue of the shrinking civic space. Because once, there are regulations and uh, more and more legislations that are making it difficult for human rights defenders to really carry out their work. In Nigeria, only this week, there is a new requirement. Of course, that has always been there for NGOs to comply with SCUMO, which is government instrument that looks at issues of terrorism and financing and drug-related issues. However, the new policy direction is that banks are now under obligation to demand such documents before they even have banking relationship with CSO. So the operating environment is, on daily basis being made small and constricted for CSOs and right defenders. The more they make the civic space, they constrain the civic space, the more it affects the work of human rights defenders. Next slide. I want to thank you all for your time in this. I hope this provides some insight to this panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joel. I have questions for you, but I'll hold those until we hear from Bennett Freeman on the guidance on respecting the rights of human rights defenders. Bennett, over to you.
Thank you, Allison. A pleasure to see you. I guess I'll see many of you when we have the Q&A and discussion, but really appreciate the chance to present this new comprehensive guidance and to follow Joel, and really appreciate the findings and recommendations from their report. So let's go beyond the first slide, although I would note that this is an image of the late Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated in 2016 for her opposition to a hydroelectric power dam in Honduras, and has been very much a global emblem of attacks, in her case, tragically fatal against defenders around the world. So on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back to the founding of the VPs, as we called them at the time, and to make this basic point that human rights defenders, although not explicitly mentioned with that phrase in the original principles themselves, were very much on our minds when we came together in 2000 to create the VPs. And I was personally very stricken by the the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other, the Agoni Nine, in 1995, and had it in mind to try to find an opportunity to address these issues in terms of oil and mining companies and their responsibilities relative to repressive regimes, as Nigeria was at the time, but also security forces, conflict zones, and local communities. So this original text you see here from the VPs at least get to the importance of civil society, NGOs, labor and trade unions, and local communities. If I had a chance to redo the principles 23 years later, we would certainly have referenced human rights defenders explicitly. But here we are, and I think that it's really a tribute to the VPI and that it commissioned this comprehensive guidance as well as the report from LITE-Africa. And I think that this guidance demonstrates the new priority and urgency of respecting and protecting human rights defenders for the VPI. And I know how committed, Allison, you and others at the State Department are as the U.S. government chair in advancing the defenders agenda as well as civic freedoms and civic space, both through the VPI and more generally, and very timely and welcome leadership from you and your colleagues. Let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to walk through all the details here, but I just want to have for the record these key points about that lay out facts and a few data points from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center to really make clear that attacks against defenders connected to business, indirectly or directly, not only are continuing, but indeed increasing as civic space is shrinking. And Joelle's slides really illuminated the specific risks, threats, and attacks that defenders face in various countries in Africa. But this is a global phenomenon that the VPI companies, civil society, governments face around the world. I do just want to highlight 2 points from this slide. The next to last one, that it's extractives and agribusiness that have been the most dangerous sectors for defenders, certainly others, apparel, technology, among others. But these two in particular, and of course the VPI was founded to focus on human rights in the extractive sector. And in the last several years, there's been the addition of at least a couple agribusiness companies. So here we have now the first comprehensive guidance on defenders in civic space, not only for any multi-stakeholder initiative, as Allison noted, but for the extractive sector as a whole. And some of you are aware that Unilever released in early September a comprehensive guidance focused on their operations and suppliers around the world. So we now have, as of this week, thanks to the VPI, both comprehensive guidance for extractives and thanks following the comprehensive guidance on agribusiness with Unilever. And also to note on this slide, and really a critically important point here that Joel's slides alluded to, that the attacks against defenders take place against a backdrop of shrinking civic space and a global slide towards authoritarianism in various countries around the world over the last decade or so. So it's really critically important to address the threats and risks against defenders in this broader context of civic freedom, civic space, and what we call in the guidance the enabling environment for defenders of civic freedoms in particular, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association, all of which depend in turn on the rule of law and accountable governance. Let's go to the next slide here. And this is the point here is to really acknowledge that the whole agenda around defenders and business has really moved to front and center of the business and human rights agenda over the last half dozen years. And the launch of this guidance, I think, helps cement that forward movement here. As many of you are aware, there are two primary frameworks that set forth the risks and responsibilities that business and different sectors face with respect to defenders. First is chronologically is the Shared Space Under Pressure report, Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders, released in September 2018. That report was commissioned and published by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center and International Service for Human Rights. The second report was focused just on defenders, although taking into consideration in some ways civic space as well, and that was the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights Guidance on Ensuring Respect for Human Rights Defenders in June of 2021. And those two frameworks are complementary, mutually reinforcing, are consistent with each other, but have some different areas of emphasis. But the point that I'll make in the next slide is that the guidance presented today really is a fusion, an amalgam of the two, based on a fusion and an amalgam of these two primary frameworks. What we've seen since 2018 is a growing number of companies, VPI companies and others in other sectors who have published their own defenders policies, either in the form of a paragraph or two in a previously existing human rights policy, or as a standalone policy on defenders, and in some cases, taking into account civic freedoms as well. And the slide here calls out half a dozen of the VPI companies. There are others, but half a dozen who have established policies in different formats and different lengths that focus on defenders. And I also want to highlight the continuing work of NGOs around the world, both those based in the global north, but also in the global south, and the growing coordination between NGOs around the world to focus on business and defenders. And I would call out in particular here the Zero Tolerance Initiative and the Coalition Against SLAPP Suits in Europe, and also Oxfam's recommendations for companies to respect defenders' rights, published in April of this year, 2023. Let's move to the next slide, which makes this first key point that the guidance presented today is based on a fusion of the shared space framework and UN Working Group guidance. It's informed by interviews with VPI companies, NGO, in both within the VPIs and outside, defender organizations, various individual experts. It's certainly enriched by LITE-Africa's research and interviews with defenders in Africa, their overall analysis that you heard summarized by Joelle. And what this guidance does is it presents an analytical and operational framework for the VPIs as a multi-stakeholder company initiative with a particular emphasis on companies to consider and diminish risks to defenders as the VPs are implemented around the world. And this guidance also reflects and reinforces the VPI strategy to address drivers of conflict, including repression of human rights defenders. So specifically, and I'll walk through this briskly in the next 8 slides, is the guidance outlines steps for individual company actions to diminish risk to defenders and respond to attacks. And it also encourages the VPI as a multi-stakeholder initiative to play a proactive role in supporting a safe and enabling space for defenders. And I should emphasize here that while the focus, the frame, if you will, for the guidance is really for companies, that this is also a framework for NGOs and civil society, as well as governments, both inside and outside the VPI, to work on these issues together, and we hope in coordination. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to be brisk here in walking through each of the 8 sections of the guidance itself, and not make all the points on the slides, but just wanted to lay it out as a summary for you to keep and I hope refer to. But what we're doing here is in the first section is to really emphasize that companies should understand the operational and reputational risks that they face with respect to defenders, and especially the increased risks to defenders. They should also understand the applicable frameworks for action, especially the relevant aspects of the UN guiding principles that are the basis in turn of both the shared space under pressure and the UN working group guidance. Let's go to the next slide. So the second section of the guidance focuses on identifying and reducing risks to human rights defenders. Companies should express zero tolerance for threats and attacks against defenders. Efforts within companies and with business partners to ensure that these risks and threats are well understood, and integrating risks to human rights defenders into existing risk assessment processes and due diligence efforts through consultation and dialogue. And I can't emphasize enough here the critical importance of human rights risk assessment and due diligence, not only including risk to defenders, but also being undertaken together with stakeholder and local community consultation. This due diligence and risk assessment just can't be done credibly or effectively without being intertwined with consultation, especially with local communities and defenders themselves, and that includes with marginalized groups and communities, women, indigenous peoples, and many others. But I call out those 2 in particular. Let's go to the next slide on section 3. The next step then is to integrate the findings of risk assessments into non-tolerance for threats and attacks into security arrangements. And I want to point out in particular that there's an annex to this guidance that lays out model clauses for companies to use both with private security providers for MOUs, but also with public security providers, military and police, to incorporate efforts to identify and reduce risk to defenders. So this is a practical tool that we've created through one of the annexes. And we hope very much the companies will apply those in their security arrangements, both with public and private security providers. I also just want to emphasize at the bottom of the slide the importance of working closely with host and home country governments, security forces, and of course, defenders and local communities. Let's go to the next slide on section 4. This is really a critically important slide, section of the guidance, and that is to really encourage and we hope establish the willingness of VPI companies, and some have already demonstrated this willingness, to respond when threats and attacks against defenders occur. And this guidance extrapolates from the shared space under pressure framework in particular to lay out criteria, really decision criteria that should compel companies to respond to threats and attacks in specific circumstances based on the UN guiding principles, based on the sort of beating heart, if you will, of the guiding principles, that companies have responsibilities to try to prevent or react to or remedy threats or attacks, adverse impacts on human rights if they have caused or contributed to or are linked to such attacks or adverse impacts through their business relationships. And we also, in this section, encourage companies to consider the costs and risks of action or inaction in specific circumstances. Let's go to section 5 here. And here, we also, drawing from the Shared Space Under Pressure report in particular, identify the appropriate forms of action that companies can take. And I really want to emphasize in this context the importance of what I call pragmatic flexibility in forms of response. Sometimes there's a perception that, or an expectation that responses to attacks should mostly, if not entirely, be in the form of public statements. I think that in many cases that is absolutely necessary, but in other cases, in fact, many, sometimes private engagement, meetings with security forces, host country governments, may be the best first step. And this is where the home country governments of VPI companies are particularly important, and also understanding the leverage, the different forms of leverage, degrees of leverage that different VPI companies have in different country operations that they can bring to bear. And the box there on the right side of the slide lays out the different sources and forms of leverage. So the point here is that there's not any one single appropriate or perfect response. There's a range of possible responses that can be undertaken consecutively or even concurrently in combination, depending on the particular threat or situation. Let's go to section 6 here, and ensuring that grievance mechanisms are safe and accessible for defenders. This section is largely derived from the UN Working Group's guidance on human rights defenders, and it really lays out, we hope, comprehensively but concisely, the grievance mechanisms and remedy steps that companies should be prepared to take in relation to threats or attacks against defenders. Let's go to the next slide here, laying out section 7. I'm not going to walk through all the content of this slide, but I just want to step back here and observe that it's important to think about how to measure impact and define success. And frankly, there are not clear-cut answers here. There are some elements, there's some questions, but when you think about the VPIs as a whole, measuring impact and defining success, yes, can be determined in some tangible ways, but other intangible ways. And I've always felt that sometimes the greatest success in the VPIs with the voluntary principles implementation are the threats or attacks or human rights violations or abuses that don't occur, the dogs that don't bark, so to speak. And I think that a broad observation applies in this context with respect to defenders in particular. So the failure of risk to materialize and certainly of attacks to occur is the most critical. So we lay out here in the first bullet and set of sub-bullets the different metrics that might help measure implementation. And then finally, the output set of points at the bottom of the slide. But I hope that this slide is especially the content of this slide, and in turn, the greater detail in the guidance itself is really helpful to companies as they try to measure impact as they implement, we hope, the different elements of this guidance. And then section 8, and I think this is, we're getting to the end of the slide deck, I think 2 more beyond this. But I really want to emphasize here, and this is deliberately a challenging section of the guidance, the importance of the VPIs undertaking advocacy in support of human rights defenders and civic freedoms. And this is not fundamentally an advocacy multi-stakeholder initiative. That's been clear from its inception, but it is critically important for the VPIs to have the willingness and the ability in certain situations to advocate for groups of defenders and to advocate more broadly for civic freedoms, and really want to call out here the critical importance of coordination among the Secretariat, the chair, but also especially the in-country working groups in Nigeria, Colombia, many, many other countries now around the world, and also in turn coordination with other multi-stakeholder initiatives, above all, obviously, EITI and the extractive sector, as well as ICOCA. And it's not easy doing advocacy on these issues. There's built-in tension and sometimes conflict with host country governments, but that's where the home country governments come in so significantly, and where the U.S. government guidance for their embassies around the world on how to support defenders is especially helpful. And then finally, moving to the next slide, and this is the final slide. How should companies apply this guidance to their operations? This is a large, comprehensive, detailed document. So my recommendation is that, and it's obviously up to companies themselves, but my view is that it's probably unnecessary for individual companies to rewrite the script and come up with their own 40 or 50 or 60-page guidance. The Secretariat, by commissioning this guidance, has essentially done that for VPI companies. What I do think is necessary, and I hope happens with most, if not all, of VPI companies in calendar year 2024, is to take this guidance and look also closely at the LITE-Africa report, and to come up with your own short internal guidance based on this large document here that relates the points to your already established internal policies and procedures. And I also think that this should be an opportunity and really a responsibility for VPI companies to step back and look at the policy commitments that you've already made with respect to defenders, and review and revise and strengthen those commitments. Also the same with grievance mechanisms. And I've already noted earlier in the presentation the importance of building in risk assessment and protection for defenders into the contract clauses with private security providers, the MOUs with public security providers. And then finally, it's really critically important for companies, and this is based on experience engaging with a number of companies in the last half dozen years on these issues in the extractive sectors and others, for companies to implement this guidance and address these issues more broadly on a cross-functional basis. Headquarters, field operations, in-country, regional coordination, and the different functions at the table: security, human rights, public and government affairs, legal and compliance, gender, the supply chains, business relationships. You know, this has to be a coordinated effort, and I'm convinced from half a dozen years of engaging companies on these issues specifically, and almost a quarter century now of engaging companies on business and human rights generally, that only cross-functional approaches within companies are effective when it comes to the VPIs, to defenders, and business and human rights across the board. So I'll end here, and I just with a final point that's not on the slide, that implementation of this guidance, in my opinion, is going to require not only a concerted effort by the VPI Secretariat, by VPI companies and NGO pillars, members and governments, but also by local communities and NGOs outside the process around the world. And this is a tremendous opportunity to really strengthen the VPIs with this sharp new focus and commitment on defenders. And I really hope that that defenders organizations and NGOs around the world will work with the VPIs, with the Secretariat, the in-country working groups, to implement this guidance on these critical issues. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bennett. That was fantastic and really set the stage for us to have a good conversation around how we do implement this. Carmen Rosa, you have worked directly with defenders in Guatemala over the years and done this work yourself. What are your initial reactions to the guidance, and how do you think that this guidance will be really important in helping VPI members to move forward with implementation?
Thank you. Thank you, Alison, and thank you all of you for the invitation to be part of this webinar. I want to congratulate the speakers and the authors too of these documents that have been presented to us. I would also like to thank them for their contribution today to improving the application of voluntary principles, but especially for providing practical elements that will, I am sure, improve the security and protection of human rights defenders. As Bennett said, human rights defenders play a critical function in safeguarding the rights and dignity of individuals and communities, and they should be able to carry out their work without fear and reprisals, harassment, or harm. But unfortunately, there is a direct correlation between countries' lack of democracy and less respect for human rights. This makes it more difficult to ensure populations' rights and protection, particularly for activists of human rights defenders and human rights defenders. In countries like Guatemala, human rights defenders face judicial attacks, persecution, imprisonment, exile, or death. In recent years, attacks have also included social network harassment, defamation, and criminalization of any action. We go, for example, from 1,000 attacks in 2022 to more than 3,500 in 2023. The importance of this guidance presented today is that it gives us keys to confront some of the problems that human rights defenders encounter daily in their work. On the other hand, it is very useful for companies since they often do not know how to apply their human rights policies in practice. In countries with a high level of conflicts, such as Guatemala, human rights defenders, especially those related to the defense of territory, face two types of challenges. First, dealing with the international corporations' interests, and second, protect themselves against attacks by the government and public institutions, particularly state security forces. The fact is that companies usually hire local private security firms, which have a different vision on the problem of human rights. In my country, most private security companies are run by retired military personnel. Those officials were involved in the genocide that took place in the country between 1980 and 1985. Because many of the security guards had served in the military, they shared the same vision as their superiors. Any social activist is considered a rebel or guerrilla. This is the vision that has persisted in the private security sector. This implies that their actions and responses to conflicts or security incidents are carried out with the idea that they are fighting the ideological enemy. Also, we find corporations with human rights policies, but the technicians deployed in the field are frequently related with the company's production and performance tasks. They are not experts in community relations or local culture. This leads them to trust and expect correct performance from the local private security company hired or the public officials with whom they interact. That is why this guidance is a very important resource, since in Section 3, for example, it provides practical steps for companies to establish an adequate relationship with community human rights defenders. And above all, have a strategy that includes members of private security and other contractors in the action route from the beginning. One of the difficulties for companies is operating in countries where the main violator of human rights is the state itself. That is why the idea of creating safe spaces, the development of that civic space, is a basic resource where defenders can establish an adequate relationship with the company, with public and security institutions, and NGOs on the ground. It is an innovative approach that allows us to address the problem in different ways and not depend on a single actor. Polarization and permanent mistrust between actors are one of the characteristics of conflicts, especially long-term ones. Incorporating defenders into training activities together with public institutions, NGOs, communities, and security providers is a good proposal to establish basic level of trust. This allows us to reduce the levels of polarization that are usually present in countries with serious human rights problems. Section 4 also seems relevant to me because high-risk countries for human rights defenders also tend to have high levels of impunity regarding the protection and investigation of attacks against them. The role that companies can play in supporting incident investigation process is crucial, and most importantly, to ensure that public institutions play their role. The inclusion of defenders' needs in the different ways of responding to complaints is a strong idea in Section 6. In my opinion, it is a mechanism that has the potential to work well. It is without a doubt a strategy for reducing levels of aggression and conflict. Finally, collecting information, analyzing incidents, complaints, and response to incidents allows for the establishment of lessons learned and subsequent prevention mechanisms. This will improve the company's ability to act in the future and reduce the risk of an escalation of the conflict, achieving a safer environment for all actors. And totally agree the important role of VPI's advocacy in support of human rights defenders and civic freedoms, and the coordinated engagement with other international platforms and regional and national levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen, Rosa. Hannah, the IFC has been a long-time observer of the VPI. How are you seeing this guidance, and how do you think it can be implemented not just by members and participants in the VPI, but also observers? And how do you think that we can support each other in this ecosystem of supporting human rights defenders?
Thanks, Alison, and I apologize. We've got a blackout here in Nairobi tonight, so it's a little dark where I am. But hopefully you can still see and hear me all right. So yeah, look, I think first off, I just want to say big congratulations to the VPI for kind of, leading in this space, and a special, shout out to Joel, my former NGO pillar colleague, because I think he and LITE-Africa have really been at the forefront of discussing this within the VPI, and thanks to Bennett and his team too for helping to progress this guidance, because I think it really does contribute to a growing body and focus on literature on this topic. And I think I think it's great for companies thinking about it in terms of the nexus between, security and human rights and, civic space. But I think also, it's very helpful for civil society and government, to think about the practical ways in which we can kind of address some of the risks faced by human rights defenders and investors too. And I think that's the thing that for IFC we've been watching this space for a while now alongside other investors, and we do take the issue of retaliation extremely seriously, and as part of retaliation against project stakeholders, that very much includes civil society and specifically human rights defenders, and we issued a position statement in 2018 that kind of expressed that zero tolerance for any action by an IFC client that amounts to retaliation, including threats and intimidation, harassment, violence against those that, voice an opinion regarding any activities of IFC or its clients. So I think we really tried to push on the investor side, to have a greater focus on this. And, in 2021, we released pretty comprehensive guidance for companies and investors with IDB Invest around it. And we really thought about it in terms of very much complementary to what we're seeing out of the VPI guidance, which is around screening, prevention, and response to retaliation. And, I think from the investor side, we're seeing more and more of pushing our clients to focus on this issue. And, even within IFC, we have
Hannah, I think we might have lost you. Anna, are you there? It's breaking up quite a bit. It might be a bandwidth issue.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but not clearly. So we can, if okay with you, we can move on to one of the Q&A questions and then come back for a reaction from you. Oh, it looks like you actually are back. So go ahead if you have bandwidth enough.
Like of all times, of course, during a public webinar, all communication systems go down. So apologies. Can you hear me? Okay, and so where did I cut off? Just talking about
just right before I asked you if you were there.
Okay, all right. Look, what I will say is we release guidance and we definitely focus on kind of screening, prevention, and response. And I think what I was going to say was, well, internally, also as part of our due diligence around clients, we're really focused now on mainstreaming reprisal risks into our project due diligence as part of contextual risk screening. And I think Carmen raised a really important point around that broader civic space is so important for people to be able to do their jobs and kind of raise legitimate concerns. And so I think being able for us as investors and also pushing companies to really understand that broader context in which we're operating, especially in countries with closed civic space, and understand that role there, and how we can enhance risk management and things like that to screen and engage more with human rights defenders and civil society. And so I just wanted to raise a couple of points. I think when we talk about retaliation and targeting, project stakeholders, we have to really highlight the spectrum of issues this covered. And I think Bennett mentioned it in terms of like the SLAPP lawsuits. Carmen, mentioned several different examples, including, around social media. And this can, be also intimidation. And it's a whole range of things that then can lead up to some of those more serious incidents around violence and even loss of life. And, I think once IFC has done quite a lot of engagement with civil society, and I see some even familiar people on the line today. And I think one of the things that we've really learned about this is that, these types of actions can start out really small and escalate. And, I think Bennett even raised the Berta Caceres example. And, if you look at that case, she had flagged those escalating risks to her safety, well beforehand. And, ultimately, it escalated where security forces were involved in her murder and company members were later convicted around that. And even though that's a very extreme example, I think it really underscores the need to focus on those early warning signals, and they can be smaller things. And so making sure that, companies and others are really focused on those things that the guidance that the VPI sets out, is really highlighting, which is grievance mechanisms, stakeholder engagement, risk assessment, all of these key aspects that are key to preventing, further reprisals. I think the other thing I just wanted to touch on, and again, thank you to Carmen for her comments on this, was, it's incredibly complicated space in which we're working, on the ground. And so, it's not black and white, this person did this. It's like, there are connections, behind the scenes in different ways. And so, when we think about, the investigation, for example, in the guidance, I think these incidents aren't clear cut, perpetrators aren't always clear cut, so it's really important to really consult the complainant and be clear on what the fact finding process can do, as well as understand the unintended risks around that, especially where law enforcement is involved. And that goes, I think, too, for some of the other guidance around stakeholder engagement. Sometimes visibility can make defenders more of a target in certain contexts. So being able to consult with them around what's appropriate in terms of types of engagement. And, you know, I think Bennett also raised the issue of leverage. And, you know, I think it's important to manage expectations about, you know, where there are limitations of companies and private sector versus, you know, government and other stakeholders, and how we can think creatively about those leverage solutions. So, you know, being able to flag that platform like the VPIs, or kind of work with different government partners in country, or kind of converge at a sector level if there is more collective influence that can be made. So I think I'll stop there, but, you know, thanks to the VPI and colleagues for really progressing this conversation. And, you know, we certainly support and will share this guidance with our clients. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hannah. So I'll move on to what we have in the Q&A. We have a lot of interesting questions already, so that's a sign of a good discussion. And I think some of these are very closely related, and so I'll take those together and then get into the more specific questions. So we have multiple questions on how this guidance will actually be implemented. And I would like to invite the Secretariat to respond, and we can give our perspective as chair as well. But some of these are across the memberships. So I'll just read the key questions from 4 different questions related to this topic. So the first said, the guidance on HRDs is great, really strong and comprehensive, but what dissemination is planned directly with impacted communities and defenders? And how will the VPI make sure it is actually being implemented? Related to that, we have a comment. We heard about the huge scale of the problem from Joelle's presentation, HRDs facing criminalization, attacks, and even killings. Looking at the HRD's guidance in the forward, it just says we encourage our members and anyone implementing the VPs to integrate policies and procedures designed to protect human rights defenders. This doesn't sound that strong given the extent of the problem. Will VPI member companies be requested to make their own standalone policies or to be pushed to implement the guidance? And Bennett did actually acknowledge this a bit during his presentation on how members can take this guidance and adapt them into their own policies without having to start from scratch. There is a lot there that companies can already incorporate. The next question related to that is, how will VPI engage all members to implement this guidance, including to ensure that all VPI members have company-wide policy commitments to not tolerate or contribute to attacks on defenders and expect their business partners to do the same? And finally, we have a question on what governments who have signed to the VPs are doing to ensure compliance with the human rights standards, which I'll go into. I can address, but I'm going to turn it over to Maura to give an overview of how we're going to disseminate this guidance, and how we're going to work with partners, members to implement this.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Allison. I'll try to be brief because I think there's also some great questions for the panel as well as the Secretariat. Just a few thoughts. I mean, one thing I should say too is I feel like the Secretariat's getting a little too much credit for the guidance, whereas it was actually member driven. This guidance came about because members themselves identified that they would like more guidance to assist them in developing good, strong policies and procedures around human rights defenders. So this really came from the members themselves. And I would add, all of our guidance and all of our tools are completely member driven. We released a conflict analysis tool last year. Earlier this year, a gender vulnerable groups, VPs 101 also last year. These tools are all developed because members themselves are implementing the voluntary principles and find gaps in best practices or need more help, which really goes to the essence of the VPs. As we all know, human rights is mandatory, right? Everyone must, companies, individuals must respect human rights. Governments must protect human rights. But the how is often not mandatory, how you get there. Best practice, I mean, even the VPs, best practice evolves, strengthens over time, gaps are filled, knowledge increases. So the how, even when due diligence is mandatory, the how evolves and strengthens over time. So I just wanted to make that point. That's really how the VPs work as well. It's risk-based. So if you have operations in Brazil and you also have operations in Arizona, you are going to manage human rights defender risks and support human rights defenders and work very differently in different contexts. And again, that's just the great flexibility of the risk-based approach. In terms of this guidance, how we're going to roll it out, great question. We will be prioritizing the translation of this. We have been working slowly but surely on translating key documents into French, Spanish, and Portuguese. We've identified Spanish as the top choice for this, or the top priority for now. We'll aim to get it translated, and which will make it more accessible. I think Bennett and others rightly talked about the importance of implementation on the ground. Of course, what we do in Ottawa is a lot less important than what really happens where the defenders are. And I think Bennett specifically referenced the working groups, and others did as well. What's great about working on the ground with the working groups is that they are broader than the VPI membership. As you know, VPI only has about 30 companies or so. This leaves hundreds of thousands of companies who are not members. And yet many of those companies are actually members of our working group. Same with the NGO communities. We tend to have very rich NGO participation. So this is an opportunity to really get the guidance out further into existing multi-stakeholder dialogues that already care about these issues, that are already working on them. And of course, I totally agree with the collaboration with other groups. And this is, for example, the EITI. They're working on these issues in many countries as well. I should say that the VPI, when certain crisis situations, when we have been very concerned about when company or an NGO has raised a specific issue, there has been multi-stakeholder collaboration on the ground to go to the the host government, and urge that government to respect human rights. This has occurred behind closed doors. I mean, this is not something that we publicize, but it happens. It's again one of the strengths of a multi-stakeholder approach. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I want to save time for the panelists. So thanks.
Okay, great. Before I move on, do any of the panelists have any quick reactions to any of that? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Joel, go ahead.
Okay, there was a question on the Q&A that specifically was directed to me.
Oh, yes. I was about to ask you that question, Joel, but
yeah,
yes. And this one, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, that where there are grievance mechanisms within company operations and human rights defenders choose to ignore and prefers to carry placard and block roads. Now the question is, it still requires a lot of engagement and collaboration between corporations and stakeholders to ensure that those grievance mechanisms are well publicized and they're made known to the public. I also, the question towards the end also says sometimes these grievance mechanisms are so difficult for them to get escalated to the top, which means there's still a problem, there's still a gap. Because a grievance mechanism properly laid out should be able to have a feedback mechanism. And if the public gets to know that the grievance mechanism in place provides opportunity for a feedback in terms of what company is doing, company response to violation issues, that it doesn't get buried up in bureaucracy and they don't get any feedback, then they will lose confidence in it, even if, no matter how robust it might be. So if the question did allude to towards the end, when it says that, sorry, let me just specifically refer to what it said. they will get more of an immediate response than going through the company's formal grievance mechanism, which often takes more time and may not be escalated to the senior leaders of the company. So if there is no mechanism that provides a feedback in terms of how the remedy and then how the issues of concern have been addressed, then they will lose faith. It will just be policies that are just in the papers, but do not translate into concrete action to address specific grievance issues. So I think it is not enough for the policies to exist. There has to be the demonstration and the willingness on top management to ensure that this tool is amenable and is something that can be relied on for grievance issues to be properly addressed. I just thought I should comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Bennett, do you have
thanks. Well, just to build quickly on Laura's response and Joel's and responding to these very, very good questions on implementation. Look, just to try to hit it on the head here, I think that this guidance can be implemented effectively to the extent that several elements fall into place more or less concurrently. Number one, that companies embrace and implement the guidance on a cross-functional basis. Number two, that the VPI Secretariat, the chair, really drive this through the in-country working groups in particular, and that there's a real imperative here of widening the circle, as already referred to by you, Allison, and by Maura, to bring in more players into the working groups at the country level, and especially defenders themselves. And that would have the further positive benefit, I think, of giving even greater vitality and legitimacy to the VPIs in country, with a focus on the defenders' issues in particular, which of course aren't the only issues, but now are a very sharp focus. And then I also think that implementation can be advanced to the extent that the VPI Secretariat, that the companies in general, the home and host country governments, are willing to engage with NGOs in particular that have been outside the VPI process. And some of them are on this call. They're deeply involved in these issues. I'm thinking of Earth Rights. I'm thinking of the Zero Tolerance Coalition. I'm thinking of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. I'm thinking of Oxfam, which was in the process for many years and departed, unfortunately, in 2013. But these are all deeply committed, capable NGOs, totally focused on these issues, who bring tremendous expertise and commitment here. And I hope that they can be partners in implementation, but frankly, also pushing accountability for implementation. And so I just hope that implementation can be supercharged by working with all these entities, and of course, finally, EITI and ICOCA, the extent to which there can be coordination with this guidance with what they do will be all to the good for defenders, local communities, and each of those multi-stakeholder initiatives.
Thanks, Bennett. And I see that we have some additional questions. Kirk just put an interesting question in the chat. I like the idea of this, Kirk. He was asking, similar to the model of the US that the USG used for the Summit of Democracy, the VPI could facilitate a year of action, which could involve workshops and internal engagement among members throughout 2024, culminating in a follow-up public webinar next year to report back on progress and discuss lessons learned. I mean, I really am interested in that idea, but curious to see if there are any reactions from our panelists or the Secretariat to that. Bennett has 2 thumbs up. Yeah, even if it's not a formal title like Year of Action, I think we certainly, as chair, are interested in seeing what we can do to support activities, trainings, et cetera, to support implementation of this guidance, and fully agree with what Bennett, Joel, and others have mentioned about this really does depend on implementation on the ground, and we will do what we can do as chair, with working with other stakeholders in the VPI to support that. I see that there's also been a question about training opportunities that are related to that. And I don't know if the Secretariat can come in on whether it may be possible to have training opportunities in the pipeline for participants in the VPI.
Okay, great. So we'll certainly work with the members on some of these interesting proposals, like the Year of Action. On the training specifically, we actually funded a training of the entire VPI membership at the annual plenary in London that took place already. We hired a professional trainer. So the VPI members have received this training who attended the plenary. They did as part of the contract, we actually have the training materials made available as well. So we've already gotten kind of going on the training side, but I do think we should do more. We have in the past gone to visit some of the working groups and provided direct training. I think Joel remembers we came to LITE-Africa last year and did some training. So this kind of, or even via webinar, once they're available in different languages as well. These are very interesting possibilities, but we do have a training available already for those who are interested in, for example, at the company level or at the operational level, if you're interested in doing the training on the ground, particularly in some places where it would be a very high priority issue. That's already available. Thanks.
Thanks, Maura. We also have a comment, which I am excited to see in the chat from Sabuhi from BP, that thanks the presenters and notes that as an implementing entity, they will incorporate the components of the guidance into the existing processes during the first quarter of 2024 and include into progress reports going forward. So that's that's an example of how a VPI participant can really take this guidance and integrate it into their policies. We also have another comment in the Q&A on from Oxfam that says that they're happy to see this new guidance on HRDs, which is very timely as we are witnessing an increase in the attacks to HRDs, especially in the mining sector, as Bennett noted in his presentation, where Oxfam is witnessing a rush to extract linked to the need for critical minerals for the energy transition. And as they noted in their recent report on battery minerals, which is called Recharging Community Consent, companies need to break away from the past and significantly step into their role in protecting HRDs in a proactive way. And also Roboto from Oxfam noted that they would like to see the word expect rather than encourage, which echoes another comment earlier in terms of members implementing these HRD policies. However, it does sound like we have participants that are already incorporating this. And, I think the encouragement is a strong encouragement, and at least from our perspective as chair. But I would love to hear more from participants, including the corporate pillar, on how they are integrating these measures into their policies, and perhaps in a future event as part of this year of action, we can hear more from corporate pillar participants on that engagement. I don't know if others have quick reactions to any of these questions. I'll also note that my colleague Deborah Klepp from the U.S. Department of State, who runs the Interagency Working Group on protection of environmental defenders, has offered up a presentation to the working group on this guidance. And so encourage Bennett and Joelle to follow up on that. I don't know if there are any comments before I move to, I think there are a couple of other questions that we can get to before the end. Oh, there's one more question actually that I would really like to hear from Bennett and Joelle on. What additional support would the guidance provide when defenders are organizations and not necessarily acting as individuals. So civil society organizations or two or more defenders working together, and gave the example of seeing this happen during the InSARS protest in Nigeria. Do either Bennett or Joel have comments on that point?
You want to go first?
This is a question from Fred that asks, what additional support would the guidance provide when there are defenders who are working together in groups rather than on an individual basis? So more akin to a civil society organization, or maybe an informal grouping of defenders working together or activists working together, such as those that participated in the InSARS protest in Nigeria.
Yeah, Bennett, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, individual defenders are at risk threat attacks, but groups of defenders are as important, and not just groups of self-identified defenders per se, but the NGOs working directly to enable and support defenders. So absolutely, yes, this guidance really applies more broadly. And the guidance has very high up early in the document very specific definitions of human rights defenders, and I refer everyone to that. So, and this also gets to the section 8 of the guidance in that slide that I presented briefly, which is the advocacy opportunity, and I believe a responsibility the VPI has to be supporting the enabling environment for defenders. And that means NGOs and civic space. And we called out on that slide in the document itself the statement that a group of VPI company and NGO members made in the summer of 2020, supporting human rights safeguarding in safeguards in policing around the world, but particularly in the U.S. context with the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis. So there's precedent for the VPI taking public advocacy positions on behalf of groups of defenders, not just individuals. And Joel, I mean, you know this so well from Nigeria, and that example cited, critically important there, right?
Yeah, you know, it's just like you have alluded to, the guidance provides that space also for organizations who are actively involved on these issues. Because, like Bennett said, even in our finding, the definition of who is a human rights defender embraces both individuals and organizations, and even informal sectors, you know, trade unions and so on. So the tools that has been developed, the guidance tool, and even some of the recommendations that are made in the comprehensive document that addresses both specific needs of individuals and organizations. And I think it is so I hope strongly that the full and comprehensive document, which is in the public domain, organizations will take time to read through and look at it and find where it is the relevant areas in terms of the work they do on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel and Bennett. I have another question. I'm using my privilege as moderator to ask this question. What do you think for participants, whether they be governments or corporations who have a desire to do more to protect human rights defenders, but may not know the first step to take? What is your recommendation for like step one in how we can work right away to start implementing this guidance?
Okay. I think in Bennett's presentation on the guidance tool, I can't remember the specific slides, but there is a clear process on how the clear process on what can be done in terms of addressing issues And yeah, the presentation made by Bennett, I think, lays out clear step by step.
Yeah.
Like I said, I can't remember the specific slide now, but there's a step-by-step process on what needs to be done, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So maybe Bennett is able to
Yeah, I
elaborate
can
on
hit it
something.
in 10 seconds, building on what Joel just said. If you were starting, I would read the guidance. I would look at LITE-Africa's report, but 3 immediate steps. Number 1, risk assessment. Number 2, policy commitment. Number 3, operational implementation. And each of those 3 grounded in stakeholder engagement, local community engagement, and actually meeting with, talking with, listening to defenders themselves. 1, 2, 3. It's a lot more than that, but those are the 3 starting points that all need to be connected.
That's great. And let me just dig into that a bit further. In terms of, we've heard at times from organizations that mean well that they do struggle to define who a human rights defender is and which groups that they should be consulting with on the ground to help them understand that. Do you have any advice for those in that situation?
Quickly, and others may weigh in. This is a really important issue. So let me reiterate that the guidance we produced has a whole page laying out specific definitions of defenders that's grounded actually in the UN definitions of defenders, but we extrapolate and explain further. But look, some companies have expressed concerns privately and sometimes publicly over the years about the legitimacy of certain defenders or those characterizing themselves as defenders. And I think we all know that in human nature and social relations, if you will, that there are people with different motivations and intentions and agendas, and that's life, that's the world. But if companies are worried about the legitimacy of a particular self-declared defender, there's 2 things they've got to do. And we're very clear about this in the guidance. Number 1 is they need to do due diligence and engagement to basically figure out who's who and what's what in local communities, and to not sideline or marginalize a particular individual or group of individuals, especially if they are critics of the company. And second, to listen to and respect critics of company projects and operations. This is a challenge that the VPI has faced and tried to address since its inception. And just because, not just because, especially because there's criticism, sometimes harsh criticism, opposition to a particular project or pipeline, it's all the more important for companies to listen to and to respect that criticism and respond, we hope, constructively. So look, critics have rights, and even those, of course they do. I mean, that's the whole point of civil society and the rule of law and human rights, for God's sake. But the really fundamental point, I think, for companies is that to respect the rights of critics, and even if an individual may not have full legitimacy in their own community, and the company discerns that, that person's life and rights still must be respected. So this is really tricky, sensitive stuff. But what's critical here is that companies don't dismiss critics who they may feel may not be legitimate. They nonetheless have to engage and respect their rights and not jump to the conclusions.
Great.
And just to quickly add to what Bennett has said, is also to what are the specific issues that the individuals or organizations are compassionate about. Like I mentioned during the plenary, the issue of human rights defenders is not being like a minister of the gospel or a pastor. Somebody could just rise up, or some organizations or some group could just rise up just to deal on the specific issues. And when these issues are being addressed, they may decide not to continue as defenders. And the issue of legitimacy, sometimes it's a very question, is somehow, what are you trying to establish? The question that should be asked is, let them be critics, but are the issues they are raising, are they genuine issues that need to be addressed. And, you know, do they really, are they related to company operation? Are they negatively impacting on the rights of the community and the people in those communities? You know, I think that's one thing. That's where the issue of risk assessment becomes very critical. So it's not just enough to say, oh, these are critics, they are not legitimate, they don't have registered or address, or they are not, you know, people who are known in society. The issues they care about are the issues that we should be concerned with. Do they raise some legitimate concern as regards to human rights defenders and issues? You know, I think that's where we need to really look at it. Not necessarily it's like, don't look at the messenger, but look at the message, that kind of talk. I think that's more helpful than being the judge in your own case when you are being criticized or being accused of doing things that do not respect the right of the local communities, and then you go on the other way and say, oh, the voices are not legitimate. Who defines legitimacy in this context?
Great points. And I know we're at time. I really, really appreciate the insights of all of the panelists, and I'm extremely excited that we are just at the beginning of this implementation process. We're equipped with excellent recommendations, and now it's on all of us as participants and observers and you know, supporters of the voluntary principles implementation to take it upon ourselves to do our part in implementing these recommendations. With that, unless there are any final remarks from the panelists, Bennett, it looks like you might have a final.
I want to thank Allison, you and the U.S. government, and you know all those who work on the issues, and Maura and the Secretariat, but all those that Ragnhild Handegard and I interviewed to produce the guidance. And I want to thank her in particular for working with me for 1.5 years, almost 2 years on this big piece of work. We spent hundreds of hours working on this together, and she's not on the webinar with us this morning, but I just want to call out Ragnhild in particular, my associate, and for her wonderful work. But thanks to all of you.
Okay, great. Yes. And Maura, any final words before we close? All right. Well, with that, thank you.
For me.
Oh, okay. All right. With that, thank you all for joining, and we look forward to working together on next steps. Thanks again, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.